So the transatlantic slave trade, started in the 1500s and carried on through centuries, but in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the tide really turned and public opinion was really not so favorable towards carrying people across the ocean in ships. And in 1807, Britain made the slave trade illegal. In 1808, the United States made it illegal. In 1820, Spain made it illegal. But that doesn't mean it ended. There were still people who found that they could make money in what was now the illicit slave trade, and they continued to put these clandestine operations together, sail to the west coast of Africa, get people somehow, some way, carry them across the Atlantic yet again, and sell them to Cuba or plantations in the U.S. illegally. We think of the transatlantic slave trade and we have an image of, people crowded on the ships. And yes, that is sort of a consistent thing through the history of that. But we have to remember the transatlantic slave trade happened for 3.5 centuries. I mean, that's just a massive amount of time. And it changed through time. So when you look at a ship like the Henrietta Marie, which sailed in 1699, 1700. The way it operated is completely different than the way that Guerrero operated. In the eyes of society at that time, the Henrietta Marie was owned, it was operated, it had been the whole venture put together by a group of respected London businessmen. And it's what they did for a living, and it was a legitimate business. In the case of Guerrero, you literally have pirates running the ship. I mean, guys who made their money by robbing other ships, stealing things, going across the Atlantic, stealing people, and then selling those people illegally in Cuba. Couldn't have been any more different, the set of circumstances between the legitimate business of Henrietta Marie and the illegal piracy of Guerrero. And it's really important to understand those differences and those details, because it was not this monumental thing that was the same across centuries. In 1859, that illegal trade sort of ticked upward, and the United States said, this is really getting ridiculous, because there were so many US-based ships that were engaged in this illegal business. Many of those American ships were sending their cargoes into Cuba. So President Buchanan and the Navy, they decided, we're going to put a blockade around Cuba. And that's what they did. In the fall of 1859, they stationed 4 U.S. Navy steamers, 2 on the south side of Cuba, 2 on the north side of Cuba, to simply patrol and look for illegal American slavers going into the island. 3 illegal U.S.-owned slave ships were captured by the Navy. Well, Key West was the nearest U.S. port to those captures, and so those ships were taken control of by the Navy, towed up here to Key West. Each one of them had roughly 500 people. With those 3 ships, there were now 1,432 African refugees brought here to Key West, tiny little island with about 3,000 people on it. The U.S. Marshal here, a man named Fernando Moreno, he was the government representative here. He took control of those people and built, with the help of the island under government contract, built a compound called the Barracoons on the south side of the island, a 3-acre compound, enclosed it with a fence, built a hospital, built barracks, built a kitchen, and those 1,432 people lived in that compound for the spring and summer of 1860. These people were naked, they were hungry, they were sick, and they had to be taken care of. While they were here, there were 3 doctors working almost 24/7 to help nurse these people back to health, but it was just too much. The situation was too much. They were too sick, and medicine just couldn't keep up with them. Ultimately, the U.S. government said, well, they need to be taken to Liberia. That was the general U.S. policy at that time. So during that time, while they waited for the government to make up its mind, for ships then to be brought from New York City to then carry those people across the Atlantic again to Liberia, While they waited, 295 people died here in Key West. As they died, they were carried from the compound down to another beach on the south shore, we now call Higgs Beach, and they were buried in sand graves, lined up in rows on that beach. We do have one account of a burial that was printed in the local newspaper here. The first burial was the death of a baby, an infant, months-old infant. That child was carried from the compound, carried from there down the south shore of the island to Higgs Beach with a procession of both Key Westers and African people, buried in this very moving ceremony, and then everybody weeping and wailing as they grieved back towards the Barracoon compound. So it's a very moving account. It's quite descriptive, and it does tell us that yes, many of these people were children. You know, we talk about the small shackles on the Henrietta Marie. We know for a fact on these 3 ships that came into were brought here into Key West, probably 80% of those people were children. I'd say the majority between the ages of 8 and 16. Really, as we were doing research here, it became increasingly clear as to where these burials took place. I mean, we could start taking all the historical evidence and saying, okay, it's kind of narrowing down to this spot. And then really the question at that point became, could those graves still be there? In that first survey, we found within an hour 15 graves lined up in a row, right exactly where they should have been. There they were, the graves of the African cemetery, still there under what was now a recreational beach with volleyball courts and picnic tables and people, you know, just hanging out enjoying the Key West weather without a clue that you have these, you know, terrible saga buried right below them. So everybody here in the community agreed that yes, we need to recognize this site in some way, and so working with the county, developed a memorial, installed that in 2007. It was completed, and that is there still today. It's, you know, it's important to look at these wrecks of these ships to understand the transatlantic slave trade, because it has just such implications for today. I mean, you know, so much of our society has echoes through, you know, through those different stories, and you know, the situations we see today. Why do we have, you know, poor health in the black communities, or poverty, or you know, bad schools, or you know, high crime rates? Well, I mean, you can trace all of those things right back to these slave ships. You can't have millions of people suppressed and oppressed for centuries and then suddenly expect everything to be okay. You know, culture doesn't work that way, and so we see all these things today that just trace right back. I mean, I can see as clear as a bell, you know, to Henrietta Marie or other ships, you know, and I think people have just been consistently awful through time. I mean, you can see that, you know, these people who are willing, they knew that it was not right, you know, to buy and sell people and trade people, but they did it because they could make money. And it's amazing what people will do, would have done back then, did do back then, and what they'll do today to just make money through the exploitation of others. It's, you know, it's so easy in talking about these people caught up in this, and, you know, yes, to inadvertently dehumanize them. And I'll tell you, I almost never use the term slaves, because these people weren't slaves. In the case of the people buried in Higgs Beach, these were refugees. These were people who really were never slaves. They were intended to be slaves in Cuba, but that never happened. They were African captives carried across the ocean on what we call slave ships, for a lack of a better term. Those ships, though, were intercepted by the Navy. They were taken control of by the U.S. government. And those people here on Key West were refugees awaiting some sort of other permanent status where they could not be enslaved. And so African captives, African people, children, men, women, all those terms are acceptable. Slaves is not.